My parents hated me because I'm infertile and convinced my husband he deserved better. But 3 years later, they're shocked to see me with a baby and are begging for a chance. I'm 30 now, and I recently ran into my parents and my ex-husband, Scott, who's 33. I'm not sure how to feel about that encounter. For context, I haven't spoken to my parents or Scott in nearly 3 years since our divorce. I've gone out of my way to avoid them because they nearly destroyed my life and mental health when I was still with them, to the point I felt I didn't deserve to exist. After the divorce, I moved to the suburbs and tried to build a new life, far from everyone tied to my past. So, seeing them recently was deeply traumatic, and I said things I'm not sure were the best for me. Growing up, my parents always wanted a son. They didn't mistreat me, but it was clear they'd have treated me differently if I were a boy. My mom even said so several times. I tried to be the son they never had, but I couldn't. After college, living on my own, I still tried to stay in touch with them because they were my only family. I wasn't close to my grandparents, and I had no aunts or uncles there for me. So, I accepted that, despite their distance, they were all I had. They weren't keen on staying in touch, but I kept trying. At 23, I started dating Scott. We met at a concert, and there was an instant spark. After 6 months, I introduced him to my parents, and suddenly they made more effort to stay in contact, calling more, asking about my relationship, showing interest in my life. I noticed the change but welcomed it, so I didn't question it. The more I dated Scott, the more involved my parents became, and for a while, it felt like we were a big, happy family. I was thrilled because it was all I'd ever wanted, but I should have questioned it. After just over 2 years of dating, we got engaged, then married after 3 years together. For a while, married life was great, and I loved being a newlywed. But 6 months after the wedding, my parents started hinting they wanted a grandchild. At 26, I wasn't ready and wanted to wait a couple of years, but their insistence led me to talk to Scott, who was eager to start a family. So, we began trying for a baby soon after that. We tried for months with no success, so we suspected something was wrong and got tested. Unfortunately, I was diagnosed as infertile. It was a shock to us both, but my parents were more devastated than we were and didn't hide it. When we told them, my dad actually walked out instead of comforting me. We decided to pause trying, and Scott and I discussed options like in vitro fertilization, IVF, but it was expensive, with no guaranteed success. We agreed to wait until we could afford multiple rounds. Content but a bit upset. My parents, however, were furious. They stopped visiting, stopped talking to me, and no matter how I explained it wasn't my fault, they wouldn't listen. After weeks of their behavior, I was so hurt that I called them out. I told them they were treating me cruelly just because I couldn't give them a grandchild yet, and it made me doubt they'd even be good grandparents if I did have a child. I said they treated me harshly my whole life for not being a boy and favored Scott. I tried to maintain our relationship, but I was done. I asked them to stay away forever. It was hard because I'd craved their approval for so long, but I realized it was impossible. Instead of apologizing, they doubled down, saying I was worthless as a woman because I couldn't have children and they wanted nothing to do with me. It hurt, but at least I knew where I stood. After that call, our relationship ended. When I told Scott about it, he was supportive at first, but soon his behavior changed too. I ignored it initially, already struggling mentally, unwilling to admit my husband might leave me. I pretended everything was fine, but within months, he became cold and distant. I did everything to save our marriage, but it didn't help. 3 months later, he came home with divorce papers, saying he was done. I wasn't shocked but tried reasoning, saying we could try for a baby later. He said there were too many issues he wanted to leave behind and needed it over quickly because it was hard for both of us. The divorce took 7 months to finalize, the hardest of my life. I was utterly alone and broken to make matters worse. Weeks after Scott moved out, I learned through family that he was living with my parents. I spoke to my in-laws, an awkward conversation, and they confirmed my parents had been in contact with Scott for months, likely manipulating him to leave me. My in-laws didn't approve, but Scott had fought with them and cut contact. They said he'd hinted my parents told him he deserved better. I'm not sure what exactly they said, but I suspect they were desperate for a grandchild any way possible. Since I was out of their lives, they took Scott under their wing to get him to leave me. After the divorce, I was shattered but eventually recovered. I moved to the suburbs, got a new job, changed my look, and blocked my parents and Scott on social media. I told friends and family I didn't want to hear about them or for them to know about me. They respected that, and for 3 years, I've been in therapy, living well. The only thing bothering me was not having a baby. I still wanted to be a mother. Last year, I started IVF with an anonymous donor and got pregnant. 4 months ago, I gave birth to my daughter. Life's been amazing since, and I'm truly happy. 4 days ago, I was walking with her when I ran into my parents and Scott. I was stunned to see them on my street, initially thinking they were there for me, but they were leaving a house nearby. When they saw me, I froze, wanting to run but unable to move. They approached, greeted me, and immediately asked about the baby, saying I was supposed to be infertile. I told them the truth. As I started heading home, Scott stopped me, saying he was glad to see me because he'd been thinking about me and felt our encounter was a sign to fix things and give our relationship another chance. My parents insisted I invite them over to talk about my life, as they'd clearly missed a lot. I was horrified they thought I'd welcome them after everything. It took me 3 years to heal, and I'm still in therapy. So I snapped. I told them I'd rather invite a pack of bloodthirsty wild animals than them, as even they'd be better company. I accused them of only caring now because I had a baby. My parents wanted a grandchild, and Scott, unable to find anyone else, thought since I'd conceived once I could again, and he could waltz back into my life. It was disgusting. They saw me as a baby factory, not a person with feelings. They'd all abandoned me when I needed emotional support most. I expected it from my parents, who'd made it clear since childhood they wanted a son and valued women only for motherhood. But Scott was the real shock. He'd spent years with me, comforted me, yet sided with my parents for some twisted reason and left me at my lowest. I threw their words back at them. Since I was worthless as a woman and Scott deserved better, they should leave me alone. I'm usually quiet and shy, but that day I screamed at them. 3 years of pent-up rage pouring out that I stormed home, slammed the door, and felt awful, taking a couple of days off work to stay with my baby. The encounter replayed in my head. I didn't know what to do until last night when I got a call from an unknown number. I usually don't answer those, but I did. It was Scott, with my parents whispering in the background, not even trying to be discreet. I told him I didn't want him calling again, or I'd take preventive measures, and the same went for my parents. I'd ended things 3 years ago and was standing firm. Scott begged me to listen, and against my better judgment, I let him talk. He admitted he and my parents made mistakes, driven by disappointment over my infertility and my hesitation about IVF until we could afford it. They hadn't handled it well, but wanted a chance to prove they were worthy of being in my family. I told him I didn't buy their nonsense. They wouldn't care if they hadn't seen me with the baby. That was the truth, and I was done with their pretense. As I was about to hang up, my parents chimed in, saying my selfish behavior when I learned I was infertile, expecting their comfort while they struggled with the news, caused them to push me away. I hung up. I know they were just manipulating me, edit 1, Many asked why my parents didn't try for another child if they wanted a son so badly. My mom had complications during her pregnancy with me, and doctors advised waiting a few years before trying again. She was in her mid-30s when she had me, and waiting longer meant a riskier pregnancy in her late 30s. Like me, she struggled to conceive, but her mother-in-law was cruel to her about it. This time, with me, it was my own mom who couldn't empathize. That's why they only had me, a daughter. Edit 2. I'm unsure about Scott's relationship with his parents, but they seemed close. I don't know if they've reconciled since their last conflict, as I haven't spoken to them or Scott. He's an only child with no sibling rivalry, and his parents clearly loved him. I don't know why he latched onto my parents. They wanted a son, which explains their behavior toward him, but his motives are unclear. I've spent 3 years trying to forget this, so I hadn't questioned it until now. I feel I need to talk to my ex-in-laws to understand, even just for curiosity. Update 1. I contacted my ex-in-laws to learn why Scott acted the way he did. It was odd he'd visit his aunt with my parents. I knew it wasn't my fault. They abandoned me when I needed them because they're awful, but I wanted clarity. Reaching out after 3 years was awkward, but they were glad to hear from me. They said they'd reconcile with Scott after their fight and were in touch, but he'd also stayed close to my parents. Scott wasn't replacing his parents with mine. He was loved as a child. Apparently, my parents were manipulative from the start, winning him over while we were dating, inviting him to dinners without me. He thought it was something to brag about, impressing them by being himself, especially as a man, which was enough for them. They spent time alone with him without my knowledge, becoming parental figures despite his respect for his own parents. They showered him with expensive gifts and checks, which he offered for our IVF. I thought he was joking because we didn't have that money, and I didn't want him doing anything shady. He didn't tell me it was from my parents to avoid admitting their relationship. My refusal to pursue IVF, wanting to save first, gave them leverage to convince him I wasn't good enough. They brainwashed him, and that's why he left. My ex-in-laws apologized but said, as he's their only son, they couldn't cut him off. I don't blame them. They owe me nothing and were kind to tell the truth. Now I have no reason to engage with Scott or my parents. They're despicable and not worth my time. Update 2. I returned to work after nearly 2 weeks off, still having maternity leave since I didn't take the full 6 months, and my company's policy is flexible. At home, it was just my daughter and her nanny, whom I trust completely. She's well-referenced and a good person. Mid-workday, she called, saying she'd taken my daughter to her house for safety because Scott was outside mine. I agreed and called the police while rushing home. She said Scott was yelling for me to come out, then tried breaking down the door, cursing loudly, scaring my daughter. She acted fast, called me, and left through the back door to her nearby house. I'm so grateful she prioritized my daughter's safety. When I arrived, the police were there, and Scott was clearly drunk, odd for noon. I pressed charges, furious, and got a restraining order since he was unhinged. The police took him away, and my nanny returned with my daughter. I gave her the rest of the day off and stayed home. I'll need a few more days off work, but I'm happy to spend time with my favorite person. Update 3. 2 weeks since my last update, I've been busy with my daughter and started an exciting new project. I secured a restraining order against Scott, thanks to my neighbor's security footage of him drunk and causing a scene. They suggested I install my own cameras, which I will. I laughed thinking Reddit must have a deal with security camera companies. It's always the top advice. My parents, seeing the situation, have stayed away. My ex-in-laws said they've cut contact with Scott after his behavior. He struggled to find another partner, desperate for a family but unwilling to adopt. That might explain his actions, but it doesn't excuse them after what he and my parents put me through. They're still bad-mouthing me to family, but it's not working. Everyone knows they're the ones who did the worst. I'm glad they'll never meet my daughter. I won't allow it. We'll have a wonderful life together, unbothered. I'll be a far better mother than the example I had. Update 4. This update is almost funny because it shows my parents' true colors, though we already knew them. They hadn't contacted me since I blocked them everywhere, and per their words, were too ashamed to come to my house. Scott had no such shame given his actions. I haven't heard from him in a while, and the restraining order is working. Last weekend, my parents showed up. When I opened the door to tell them to leave, they said they just wanted to meet my son. They said son because when they saw my daughter that day on the street, she wasn't in pink or stereotypically feminine clothes. I dress her in neutral colors, not like TV moms obsessed with pink. They assumed she was a boy, despite no clear indicators, as she's only a few months old. I corrected them, saying she's my daughter. They looked confused, like I'd shattered their hopes. They repeated they were ashamed to come after so long but wanted to meet their grandson, again calling her a boy. I didn't correct them again, realizing what was happening. They said they'd cut ties with Scott after his behavior and wanted to repair our relationship. They asked if the baby was home, even bringing gifts, boys' toys and blue clothes. They left them at the door, and I'll likely donate them or give them to a friend with a son that I asked, "Do you really want to meet my daughter? Because she's a girl, not a boy." My mom said, but she wasn't dressed in pink that day. I explained my reasoning. They said they'd come back in a couple of hours when she was awake for feeding, but they never did. They only said they'd meet her because it was awkward, but learning she was a girl made them lose interest. I wasn't serious about letting them meet her. I don't want them in her life. I knew this might be their reaction, so I'm not surprised. Edit. It's been almost 2 months since this happened, and I haven't heard from my parents. I was right.